Okay, welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this will be the second out of 6 classes in our series Garments of the Infinite, where we've been looking at the Sephiroth. So I know a lot of you were here, what was that, 2 weeks ago? Where 2 weeks ago in the last class, in the first class, we covered some of the sort of Jewish foundations of the Sephiroth tradition, and obviously the Jewish Kabbalah is where the Sephiroth originate from. So we looked at some of that, looked at some of the foundational Jewish Kabbalistic documents, the Sepher Yetzirah, the Sepher Bahir, looked at the 32 Paths of Wisdom. We also talked about the meanings of the names of the Sephiroth. But what we weren't, or actually, so I'm just going to fill in one thing that kind of conceptually should have been in the last class that I left out, just for reasons of time. Yeah, so we can kind of pretend that the first 5 minutes of this class are really part of the last class, and then we'll get started with the topic of today proper. Okay, so the missing piece, which I think I mentioned a couple of times last class, is the divine names attributed to the Sephiroth. So I just wanted to show you those. We will come back to them I think in September. I think probably in the second class in September. It'll be like the 4th class in this, or no, 5th class maybe. Anyways, we'll come back to this. But I did feel a little funny having left it out last week because it is a very important part of the idea of the Sephiroth, and especially for the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, and for ours as well, which is that there's these different divine names, different names that appear for God, in the Torah, and the different sort of combinations of divine names as well that get worked out. And these names are associated very strongly with the Sephiroth to the point that it's almost an identity. The Sephiroth almost are the divine names. The divine itself, the Ein Sof, the limitless, is maybe like beyond name, and then so it's through the various names, through the Sephiroth, that God, does the act of creation, and also relates to the creation, relates to humanity, and we can relate, to the divine and to the qualities of the divine. Okay, so there's different traditions. You'll see some variation, but the core of this is pretty consistent. So there's at least conceptually, there's one divine name for each Sephiroth. I'll mention a few of the variations as we go through. This particular list here I got from 777, so this will be the base that you'll see. But again, I'll mention a few variations as we go through. All right, so for the first Sephiroth, the crown, Kether, our divine name is a Heye, which means something like I am, or it could also be read as I will be, but usually as I am. And of course, this is part of when God speaks to Moses, on Mount Sinai, and Moses asks, his name. He says, "Eheye Esher Eheye," I will be that I will be, or which we kind of esoterically translated as something like existence is existence. This is kind of the identity in itself, being in itself, in a sense. There's not really much variation with that. I can't, other than the full phrase "Eheye Esher Eheye." There's not really any other names for the crown. All right, and then for wisdom, we have the divine name Yah, Yod-He. Sometimes you'll also see that the tetragrammaton, Yod-He Vav-He, here for Hokmah, so that's a variation you should be aware of. And then for the third Sephra, understanding, or Binah, we have Yod-He Vav-He Elohim, though you'll also just see Elohim by itself. The Elohim, I think as we talked about a little bit last week, are often taken to be the creative powers. It is a name for God, but it has a kind of plural form, and so is often understood as the creative powers. All right, and then the fourth Sephra, below the supernal triad now, we have the Sepher Hesed. Normally Hesed is translated as mercy, but in my meditations that I've been doing, and I hope other people have done some of the meditations that I suggested 2 weeks ago, I've been kind of interested in, or thinking of Hesed as love, the primary translation of Hesed as love rather than as mercy. As we talked about last week, Hesed can equally be translated as love, or as loving kindness, or as compassion, even though mercy is the more standard. And for that, we have another, just basically a word meaning God, which is El. And you'll see that in a lot of Semitic languages. Even in Arabic, Allah, is from the same root. All right, and then for strength, the fifth Sephra, we have Elohim Gibor, which means Gibor there, is a word for strength, or related. The root for strength is Gimel Beth Resh, which you see in the name Geburah. You also see it in the name Gabriel, the archangel, which means something like strong one of God would be an interpretation of Gabriel's name. All right, and then for Tefereth, beauty, there's a few different ones. Sometimes you'll see just the tetragrammaton alone, or other things, tetragrammaton paired with some other names. The one we usually use in our tradition is Yod-He, Vav-He, Eloah, V'Da'ath. Eloah, V'Da'ath means something like God of knowledge. So this is like tetragrammaton, God of knowledge. For practical purposes, we often take what the Notaricon, the initials of this phrase, which are Yod, Aleph, Vav, and then interpret that as Greek and render this as the Greek divine name Iao. So you will definitely see some variation in the names for Tefereth there, but this is the main one for our tradition, plus its Notaricon Iao. All right, and then for the seventh Sepher, victory, Netzach, we have Yod-He, Vav-He, Zavaoth. Zavaoth means something like of hosts, so this is like tetragrammaton of hosts. And then for the eighth Sepher, splendor, Hod, we have Elohim Zavaoth. Again, the word Zavaoth there, of hosts, referring to the multiplicity. Also to angel, it gets interpreted in different ways. All right, and then for the foundation, the ninth Sepher, Yesod, we have Shaddai El Chai. There's also a few variations you'll see on this, though usually there's a form, the Chai, or a form of that word, like Chaim, is used, and Chai means life. Shaddai is another just title or name for God. It's sometimes translated into English as Almighty. So this is something like, Almighty God of life. And this idea of the God of life is very important for the Sepher Yesod, and even in the sort of core Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, often has a sexual meaning. This is like the power of generation, the sex force, the power of generativity, and Yesod is always associated with like the genital center. So this is God as kind of productive, generative force, or that force in its most divine form, however we want to think about that. All right, and then finally we have the 10th Sepher Malkuth, which we usually translate as kingdom, but as I mentioned last time, the Jewish tradition largely sees it as kingship or sovereignty. I always want to add an extra syllable to that word and say sovereignty, but it's sovereignty. Right, and we talked a little bit about that distinction, so hopefully everyone remembers that from last class. And the divine name here, which again, you'll see some variation. 777 listed Adonai Melech. Melech is the word for king. And Adonai means Lord, another name for God. Sometimes you'll see just Adonai by itself, or Adonai paired with other words sometimes as well. Okay, so this is just a core part of the Jewish, core of the tradition. So I just wanted to mention it here, but we will come back to it later. In a few classes from now. Okay, so let's jump into our topic for today. I'll just read this. I've got a kind of long quote here from Crowley's Book of Thoth. This is just the first part of it. This quote will actually kind of surround or bracket our entire discussion today. So I'm just going to read the quote and then maybe I'll make a few comments as I go through. So this is from Crowley's Book of Thoth, from some of the introductory material, which is a really great summary. The introductory material is a really great summary of Crowley's entire system and the kind of final flowering of Crowley's most mature thinking about the Hermetic Kabbalah. All right, so he says, it seems probable that the Kabbalists who invented the tree of life were inspired by Pythagoras, or that both he and they derived their knowledge from a common source in higher antiquity. You'll see in some kind of Renaissance era Christian Kabbalistic texts that they believe that the Kabbalists lived before Pythagoras. So they'll sometimes say that Pythagoras got his material from the Kabbalists, when historically speaking, it's the other way around, which Crowley is aware of. But Crowley never really cares that much about these types of things and is very practical and pragmatic about it. So he says, in any case, both schools agree upon one fundamental postulate, which is as follows. Ultimate reality is best described by numbers and their interplay. It is interesting to note that modern mathematical physics has been finally driven to some similar assumption. This is actually, I think, a really profound point. The idea that number underlies the physical world or is at the root of the physical world, and even that we can describe the physical world using number would have been something that, for a lot of the Western philosophical tradition, the tradition coming out of Aristotle in particular, this would have thought to have been impossible. The idea that you could throw an object and then use mathematics to like calculate the trajectory of that object, they wouldn't have believed that would have been possible. The rate at which an object falls is determined by its elemental composition, and the elements simply seek their natural place. Earth wants to go to the bottom, water on top of it, fire rises the highest, and then air rises somewhat below fire. But the idea that there's like a mathematical formulae that could describe this for the entire Aristotelian tradition and a lot of the Western tradition would have thought this was impossible. But with Newton, the Principia Mathematica, his formulation of classical mechanics showed that this is false. That numbers can describe reality. That we can describe physical processes and motion with number. Though that fact is often not given any kind of importance, and there's not a lot of sort of philosophical import like derived from that. I think people just sort of take for granted the idea that number could describe physical things when looked at from the light of classical tradition. This is actually a very significant thing that points to the nature of reality. Okay, so keeping on here, it is interesting. Let's see. Further, the attempt to describe reality by a single definite term has been abandoned. Modern thought conceives reality under the image of a ring of 10 ideas, such as potential, matter, and so on. Each term has no meaning in itself. It can only be understood in terms of the others. This is exactly the conclusion which appears earlier in this essay with regard to the way in which the planets, elements, and signs were all dependent on each other and composed of each other. Hopefully anyone who, especially if you were here for the last class series on the paths, letters, and correspondences, have some idea of what he means by that. But the further attempt to reach reality led the Kabbalists to sum up the qualities of these rather vague and literary ideas by referring them all to the numbers of the decimal scale. So the vague and literary ideas here would basically be like everything we talked about in the last class. Numbers, then, are the nearest approach to reality, which is shown in this system. The number 4, for instance, is not so especially the result of adding 1 to 3, or squaring 2, or having 8. It is a thing in itself, with all sorts of moral, sensible, and intellectual qualities. It symbolizes such ideas as law, restraint, power, protection, and stability. All right, so what we're going to be talking about today is the Pythagorean and Platonic traditions, and specifically how they relate to the Sephiroth, or ideas taken from those things that very specifically underlie the Sephiroth. We're not going to be able to cover, the Pythagoras himself or his school or the legacy of his school, and certainly we're going to do a very, very, very sort of cursory take on the Platonists and Neoplatonists. But hopefully it'll give you some kind of sense of some of the background ideas that go into the Sephiroth, and the way that, I think especially in the Hermetic Kabbalah, there's kind of a return in a way to some of the Greek roots, where in the Jewish, because of Jewish orthodoxy and things like that, a lot of ideas taken from Greek philosophy, which is pagan by and large, are unacceptable and get altered. And so in a lot of ways, there's a reconnecting of the tradition to its Greek roots. At least that's the way I like to look at it. Okay, so I'll give you a real brief tour of some of the main kind of players here. So this here is Pythagoras, who lived sort of circa 570, was born circa 570 BCE, and then died somewhere around 490 BCE. This painting here is by Augustus J. Knapp, which was done in the 1920s, and it was done as an illustration for Manly P. Hall's book. What is it? Secret Teachings of All Ages, I think it's called, which is not the most historically reliable book, but a really important one in the story of the 20th century esoteric tradition. So Pythagoras, he was Italian, and he, well, we know some things about his life, and there's some biographies of him, though how reliable the biographies are, since the biographies were written hundreds of years after his life, how reliable they are is sort of in question, and there's a lot that we don't know about Pythagoras. He probably traveled a lot. I think scholars now agree that he did spend time in Egypt, that he was an initiate of several mystery traditions. In Iamblichus, who we'll also talk about Iamblichus today, in his life of Pythagoras, he also reports that Pythagoras spent time in Persia studying with the Zoroastrians, though most scholars think that did not happen. But in any case, Pythagoras travels around, he studies. He would have been aware of, now he's pre-Socratic, Socrates and Plato haven't been born yet, but he's aware of some of the early pre-Socratic philosophers, people like Thales and Anaximander. And so he's aware of this project of looking at trying to find something like a foundational concept that underlies reality. But for a lot of the pre-Socratics, this is like an elemental thing. Like for Thales, right, water is the source of all things. But for Pythagoras, it's more like number. Pythagoras is also the first person to use the term philosopher. Before Pythagoras, people had been described as, or maybe even described themselves as like sophos, meaning something like sage or wise one. But Pythagoras didn't call himself wise. He called himself a philosopher, which is a lover of wisdom. Let's see. Pythagoras eventually sort of returns to Italy after his travels and founds a school there. The school was, well, they had several levels of membership. If you wanted to kind of join the Pythagoreans and study with them, you would have a few years of kind of casual acquaintance with the school, attending lectures, talking with the students and things like that. And Pythagoras and the others would be kind of observing you. And then you could join, becoming a more full member. You would go through a 5-year period of silence. You would not speak for 5 years, and you would just sort of listen to the lectures and study. You wouldn't actually see Pythagoras. He would have been hidden behind like a screen, and it wasn't until you entered like the inner circle that you would actually be able to see him directly. So some of those ideas kind of resonate, I think, with the modern esoteric tradition of these kind of graded steps of being able to receive wisdom but not fully see it until eventually you're received into like the inner school, and then finally you can see him directly. There's all sorts of miracles and powers are attributed to Pythagoras. He was said to, Pythagoras taught a doctrine of reincarnation, and he was said to remember his past lives. In addition to the mathematical and philosophical aspects of the school, a lot of what Pythagoras taught was more like a way of life. They were vegetarians because of the idea that all beings are related, and because of the idea of the rebirth of souls. They didn't eat animal flesh. They generally didn't cut their hair and beards. People describe them as kind of ancient Greek hippies. Yeah, but it was a sort of a way of life that Pythagoras taught beyond just the kind of mathematical and philosophical doctrines. And it's the Pythagorean way of life that ends up being one of the largest parts of, or the kind of legacies of Pythagoras in the ancient world, but we won't be talking about that too much today. All right, maybe I'll just point out just a couple of things in this painting here. Now, this is obviously very influenced by like Masonic symbolism as well, and so in that way, it's a little bit anachronistic. You see here, I hope everyone can see my cursor there. This is a kind of illustration of the Pythagorean theorem, showing that the squares on the sides of a right triangle, the sum of the squares on the short sides is equal to the square on the hypotenuse. We also see some Masonic symbolism like the compass and square there. We see a lyre here. Music was very important for Pythagoras. Pythagoras probably did something like what we would call like music healing. He believed that certain modes and certain musical tones and sequences of musical tones could produce certain effects, on the soul. And since one of their things they really valued was a kind of a calm and clear disposition, being in a way almost reminiscent of what the Stoics will do later, of not being overly disordered by like the ups and downs of life, but remaining sort of calm and clear. Sort of removed from that somewhat, and so the use of certain musical patterns helped to instill this calmness in the soul and to prepare people for receiving wisdom. But another thing that's really important is that we don't have really time to get into the details of this, but the Pythagorean monochord, which is a single stringed instrument with a movable bridge, so that you can produce different like ratios between the string length. The string's like divided at a certain point. So if the bridge is right in the middle of the monochord, you have two sections of equal length. That's like a 1-to-1 ratio. And then you can form different ratios, which will define the musical scale. And so this fact that the musical scale and these the properties of the scale, which is really audible. When certain ratios are sounded, you can hear what happens because of the overtone series and all the stuff that we don't really have time to get into now. But it showed to the Pythagoreans that these mathematical ratios really exist in nature. So this is a really important fundamental insight that the mathematics, is actually manifest in nature, and music and the ratios that form the musical scale are the main points of this. Above Pythagoras' head there, in a triangle, you see 10, they're actually like little iodes, little points. This is a figure called the tetractys, which we'll talk about later today. All right, let's just move on because we've got a lot to get through. All right, so here we have Socrates. I assume most of you is vaguely familiar with who Socrates is. He was Plato's teacher, early philosopher. In some ways, the founder of what I might think of as the Western, philosophical tradition proper. He didn't write anything himself. Plato is the one who recorded his teachings, at least in Plato's early dialogues. The image you see here, this is from the French painter David. It's a cropped image of his painting of the death of Socrates. Socrates, of course, was, as most of you I'm sure know, was sentenced to death by the Athenians for the crime of corrupting the youth, right? Because he was questioning the values and structures of his society, and was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock. So that's the cup of hemlock there that he's reaching for on the left. And he's pointing upwards, indicating the Platonic doctrine of the world of forms, which we will talk about now. All right, so here we've got, I'm mainly talking about Plato here. I just sort of included Aristotle because I was using different sort of images from art history here. This is, again, a cropped detail from Raphael's School of Athens. And he's got Plato and Aristotle right in the center. And so, yeah, Plato is a student of Socrates. Records some of Socrates' teachings. Though most people think that it's only the early dialogues of Plato that record the kind of authentic Socratic teachings, and that Plato then later develops his own ideas. There's so much in Plato. Plato is extremely complex and really interesting too. I mean, Plato writes in the form of dialogues, and there's a very literary quality to them. Plato's also a bit of a trickster in a lot of ways. And it's not really clear. Later on, he'll get interpreted as if he taught a single kind of coherent doctrine across all of his dialogues, but that's really not clear, and most contemporary philosophers don't believe that to have been the case, that maybe more about a process and showing people the process of philosophical reasoning and introducing certain ideas rather than teaching a definite doctrine. The really critical thing I think to know about Plato here is the idea of the forms. So Plato has the idea that the various things that we see in the world are imperfect reflections of perfect forms that exist eternally. Sometimes this is described as being two separate worlds. There's a world of forms, though this is probably actually kind of a misinterpretation of Plato, especially in kind of modern times. This interpretation has come up. It's pretty clear, especially from the Neoplatonists, that they understood Plato as teaching a doctrine of there being just only the one cosmos, and that the cosmos is a single, organic, unified whole. It's not made of two separate worlds. So Plato's not nearly as dualistic as he's sometimes interpreted to be. But and exactly what these forms are and how many of the forms there are is sort of varies from dialogue to dialogue. There's probably not forms of specific objects or specific animals. You have things like the form of harmony or the form of what else are some other ones? Like the form of similarity, the form of difference, the form of beauty, the form of the good. Now, this idea of the good is sometimes elevated above the other forms, but by and large, there's really just sort of two levels in Plato. You have the physical bodies in the world that make up the sensible world that we live in, and then the forms. And then sometimes it's clear that the good or the form of the good stands above the other forms and is their source, and is something close to what we might think of as a divine originary principle. Now, his student Aristotle, again, who we're not really going to talk about much today, and so you can see that Plato is pointing upward, indicating that that the truth in the real reality is in these abstract forms, whereas Aristotle is pointing kind of down into the world, indicating that in his philosophy, the forms are never separate from their material manifestations, and that's what Raphael is depicting there with these two gestures. Interestingly, I always think if you kind of combine Plato and Aristotle in this image, you'll get the magician of the tarot, making the as above, so below gesture, or Baphomet making the same gesture, sort of pointing up and pointing down. Okay, so after Plato, Plato founds a school. There's a school in Athens, which continues for 300 or so years. Eventually it's destroyed after the Romans, by a Roman general, after the Romans take Athens. The Pythagorean school also doesn't last all that long and eventually sort of dissipates. But many of the Pythagorean teachers kind of spread out over the ancient world, and so the teachings of Pythagoras continue, but not a school. Now there's a continuous development from what we call a kind of early Platonism to what gets called Middle Platonism, and it's the Middle Platonists that have what's called a dogmatic interpretation of Plato, where they say that Plato taught a single definite doctrine. They're not dogmatic in the sense of like fundamentalist fanatics or something like that, but just dogmatic in the sense that Plato had a dogma, a teaching. Right, and that's important for the Neoplatonists later. They try to interpret Plato in this kind of holistic sort of way. And then in the 1st century CE, there's a kind of a revival of interest in Pythagorean things. Now there's no kind of direct lineage back to the early Pythagoreans, and there's a lot of question about how much of what gets called sort of this Neo-Pythagorean movement, how close it would have been to the original Pythagorean movement. But they adopt some of the lifestyle things again from the Pythagoreans. Think of vegetarianism, usually having uncut hair and beard, and other things as well. And so this really, the Pythagorean, this sort of Neo-Pythagorean tradition really blends in with Platonism. And by the time we get to Neoplatonism, and this is Plotinus here, who's generally thought to be the first Neoplatonist, that there's not really like a hard and fast line between the Middle Platonists and what we call the Neoplatonists. And certainly they wouldn't have thought of themselves as Neoplatonists, they would have just thought of themselves as Platonists. Or some of them actually thought of, as we'll see, some of them actually thought of themselves as Pythagoreans rather than as Platonists. But we generally say that Plotinus is the first of the Neoplatonists. So Plotinus is very, obviously influenced by Plato, influenced by Aristotle, influenced by the Stoics, even somewhat by the skeptics. He's aware of kind of Gnosticism and Christianity. Plotinus was born in northern Egypt, not in Alexandria. I'm forgetting which, I want to say Hermopolis, but I'm forgetting which city it was now. But yeah, he's born in northern Egypt. We don't know, and Porphyry, his student and biographer, doesn't think it important to record whether he's actually like ethnically Egyptian or whether he was the child of like Greek or Roman, like immigrants who had settled in northern Egypt. But he grows up speaking Greek. He travels a lot. He had actually intended to go to India, and so he joins like a Roman military campaign to try to get to India to meet some of the sages and things like that of India. Though he probably doesn't actually get all the way there, and eventually actually gets stuck out in like Persia somewhere and has to like flee back to the empire. But anyways, after he eventually ends up in Rome and founds a school in Rome and teaches there. So he teaches, a kind of version of Middle Platonism, but it's a very mystical doctrine. Plotinus is also a mystic himself. He practices contemplation, kind of turning the mind and the awareness, the soul to contemplate itself and to be able to come to a kind of consciousness of the first principle and the unitary source of things. His biographer and student Porphyry reports that 4 times in Plotinus's life he achieved a kind of full union with the One. And the way it's described, by Porphyry and others, it sounds a lot like what we would call samadhi, a kind of ecstatic, non-dual consciousness. So in addition to philosophical study, Plotinus also practiced kind of mystical contemplation. He's often like Pythagoras. He's often given, or certain kind of almost miraculous type events are attributed to him. His student Porphyry, who we'll talk about in a minute, he has a kind of crisis and decides to commit suicide, which Plotinus somehow is aware of and sends Porphyry off on a journey, which kind of gives Porphyry like a new reason to live and saves him. And Porphyry, credits Plotinus with saving his life. All right, so Plotinus has a vast and complex system, and I'm no expert in it, but I'm going to give you some really core basic ideas here. So ignore the box on the right for a moment, and we'll just look at the material on the left. So this is a basic outline of Plotinus' system, and you can see that where, sort of Plato, we really only have like the forms and then the sensible world, these two things, with maybe the good or the one beyond the forms. In Plotinus, this starts to become a little more complex and sort of stratified. So for Plotinus, you have a triad at the beginning. You have the one, which is the kind of just the pure unity from which all things descend. It's really without quality or quantity. He sometimes slightly like anthropomorphizes it. He talks about the idea that the one is engaged in a kind of continual contemplation of its own nature, though this is probably just a kind of manner of speaking, and he doesn't actually mean that the one literally contemplates in the same way that you or I could, because it's entirely beyond our ability to understand that, at least when not in that sort of ecstatic state of contemplation. All right, and then so the one then gives rise to a series of emanations. There's three. They're also called hypostases here, and so for Plotinus, this is a triad. Below the one, you have the intellect, the nous. This is the source of like the Plato's forms and the source of multiplicity. And then below this, you have the soul, which is first a kind of principle of soul. It's also what he calls like the soul of all. It's the soul that unites all things together. And then it's also the individual soul, like my soul and your soul and so on. So this soul has a kind of division into parts. And then below this triad, we have the sensible realm. This is where we live. We all live in the sensible world, the world that can be perceived by the physical senses. And then below the sensible realm, there is matter. Now, matter in itself for Plotinus, has no the sort of properties or qualities, and so it cannot be apprehended directly. But for conceptual, sort of philosophical reasons, it's posited as being there. It's imperfect. It's the source of, they don't have, it's not evil in like the Christian sense, but it is the source of, imperfection and the various, sort of lowercase like evils of the human nature, things like, selfishness or, greed or whatever else. These things are kind of attributed to matter. Though again, this isn't a strongly dualistic doctrine, and it's clear that, matter is dependent upon soul, and so not actually like a separate thing. All right, so I want to say a few things about the idea of emanation, and because this is similar to the way that the Sephiroth and the relation between the Sephiroth and their order of creation gets thought of. So Plotinus and others after him kind of see this as happening in three there's three stages of, now this is in the box here on the right, of rest, procession, and reversion. So the first principle, rest, is just the principle, like for example, the one, just sort of resting in itself. And then the procession is its sort of outer, rest could be thought of as like its inner reality. And then procession is something like its outer reality or its action. And it is specifically the giving rise to the next level of existence. This is just a kind of spontaneous, like overflowing, as if like the fullness of the principle naturally gave rise to the next principle. And then the one does not have reversion, but the other principles like intellect or soul are said to engage in reversion, which is they're kind of looking back to the principle that emanated them. So intellect would revert on the one, and then soul would like revert on the intellect, but the one doesn't revert. So this is a kind of way of thinking about how this emanation occurs and how creation occurs. Now for Plotinus, it's very important that the emanation does not occur in time, though we say the one is like prior to the intellect and the intellect is prior to the soul. This is a kind of metaphysical priority and not a temporal priority. For Plotinus, it must be that is sort of, because they believe that the cosmos is eternal, it sort of always existed and always has existed. I mean, just for that reason alone, of course, I suppose this implies, but even more than just that, there's the idea that if there was ever a time in which the one like existed on its own without the other hypostases, and even without the sensible world and without matter, that would have meant that it lacked something and needed something that it then created outside of itself. Like you have first you have the one, and then somehow the one has a desire or a need, and then it creates the intellect in order to fulfill that. But this is contradictory. The one is perfectly self-sufficient, and so this can't have been the case. And so, yeah, again, the idea that although the intellect is dependent on one, and we can say that the one is like conceptually prior to the intellect, it's not temporally prior. And I think we can think about the Sephiroth as this same sort of thing. Like even the Jewish Kabbalists talk about the emanation of the Sephiroth happening sort of in eternity, which I think we can understand as being a similar sort of principle, that there's never like a time in which the Sephiroth don't exist. The Christians end up using a sort of similar language to talk about like the Trinity, where the Son, sort of comes from the Father and is dependent from the Father, but there's never a time in which like the Father exists without the Son and the Holy Spirit. So they're getting that logic absolutely from the Platonic tradition. This also means for Plotinus anyways, that there's no ultimate teleology for the universe, because the one can't have like a plan and then decide to create in accordance with its plan or in accordance with its need. It's simply that the nature of the one and the fullness of its goodness and of its power naturally and sort of spontaneously gives rise to all of creation as the kind of, I don't know, you can think of the kind of fulfillment or the expression of the fullness of the one rather than being created like for some purpose. Okay, let's keep moving on here because we are probably going to go over already. All right, this is Pythagoras, or Plotinus' student Porphyry. He's his biographer and #1 student. He was also an important astrologer, and some of his astrological writings actually survive in the revival of Hellenistic astrology that's been going on over the last like 30 years or so. Some of Porphyry's writings are actually important. So he has this double importance as an astrologer and as a philosopher. Porphyry is from a city, it's Tyre. I've heard people say both Tyre and Tyre. That would have been at the time part of Phoenicia, though it's now, the city still exists. It's in Lebanon, a little, I think about 50 miles or so south of Beirut. Right, and then we have Iamblichus. Iamblichus is a Syrian. We usually consider Iamblichus to be a Neoplatonist, but Iamblichus would have considered himself, he thought of himself as a Pythagorean. In addition to being a philosopher in this tradition, Iamblichus is also a theurgist. So Iamblichus practices ceremonial magic, and he's a major source for the practice of theurgy. Now, Iamblichus and others, there's some problems with Plotinus' system and a lot of questions about how some of the principles of Plotinus can both interact with individual forms and remain kind of pure in and of themselves. And so one of the solutions they take is to start to multiply some of these categories and creating intermediate categories in between the fairly simple schema that we just saw for Plotinus. Iamblichus, now an important source for what we're going to look at today is a book called the Theology of Arithmetic, which was believed to have been written by Iamblichus. It was not. It's mostly a compilation of different ancient texts on it's called an arithmology, which is a study of the numbers from 1 through 10. And that's what the main bulk of our class today will be looking at. All right, and then we have just one example of one of the later Neoplatonists. This is Proclus. He was the head of eventually there's a new Platonic school founded in Athens, and Proclus is the head of that school. That school ends up getting shut down about, I forget exactly when, about 80 years or so after Proclus dies. Eventually the Christians finally shut it down. Now, in Proclus' system, Proclus is really following on from Iamblichus. Proclus really develops, and we're not going to go through this in any kind of detail, but I just wanted to show you kind of the way that this develops. So Proclus, sort of following on from Iamblichus, has a much more elaborate system than Plotinus had. So a lot of this you'll see is a kind of doubling of a lot of these categories into participated and unparticipated. The unparticipated is similar to Plotinus' idea of rest, and then the participated is similar to the idea of the procession. So you have kind of the pure abstract thing in itself, and then a somewhat lower form that is able to interact with other things. Iamblichus starts calling the one the ineffable. And it's fairly clear, at least at some point, they start to understand the one not as like the number one, or even as like a positive unity, but as something kind of transcendent and beyond number. Now for Proclus, you actually have an unparticipated ineffable one, which is just sort of very much like a kind of god of negative theology, of which nothing can really be said. But then you have a participated one, which is actually a series of ones, which are called the henads, that correspond to the pagan gods, which is really interesting. And then below that, you have a dyad of limit and limitlessness, and we'll come back to that idea. And then below that, you have being. So you can see that the one and also limit and this dyad of limit and limitlessness actually exist or sort of are before being is. Then below that, we have intellect in both participated and unparticipated forms, and then the soul, and then finally the body or the sensible realm. So again, that was an incredibly, brief or overly brief summary of all that, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what this stuff is like. Okay, so this is from, this is a Pythagorean. This is probably actually like original to the original school of Pythagoras, though this particular table, it's called the table of opposites, is preserved by Aristotle. Aristotle is actually really good about preserving pieces of older philosophers and summarizing their doctrines. And there's a lot of people that we wouldn't know anything about if Aristotle hadn't written about them. Even though, he'll then go on to disagree with them and say why his philosophy is superior, but he does do, at least in many cases, a pretty good job of transmitting and preserving some older traditions. All right, so we've got two columns here, and these are columns of opposites. So yeah, we've got limit and unlimited. Now for the Greeks, very different maybe than our intuitions. The limit is definitely the sort of the good thing, and the unlimited is sort of bad. The limit is thought of as, is connected with ideas like form and ratio and harmony, whereas the unlimited is kind of chaotic and indefinite, it's variable, it is, it's very much kind of problematic. Now we might think of the unlimited like the infinite, that is which is, beyond limit, which transcends limit, but they see of it more as like a lack, that it's like lacking in limit. So this is an interesting thing to think about, especially the way we talk about with the later Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition sees that this idea of limit and unlimited is very different than the way the Greeks look at it. All right, and then we have odd and even. This is probably the most important one to note for today because we'll be talking about number. And then we have one and plurality, and right and left, male and female, which is kind of an unfortunate one, because sort of the column on the left there, limit and odd, is given so much priority over the other. Rest and move, so we don't necessarily need to accept these, and we probably shouldn't accept these, at least not in their obvious outward form. Then we have at rest and moving, or in motion, and straight and crooked, light and darkness, good and bad. Again, this isn't like a kind of Christian idea of like good and evil. This is more like in traditional astrology, the malefics and the benefics, this good is like the nature of Venus and Jupiter, and the bad is like Mars and Saturn. They're not evil or wicked, they're necessary parts of the creation, but they're sort of unpleasant and undesirable. And then finally, square and oblong. The main idea here this is some interesting mathematical stuff here about square and oblong, having to do with some numerical patterns and the way that the Greeks did arithmetic. But the basic idea is that the squares, no matter what their size, always have the same ratio. It's always the 1-to-1 square ratio, whereas the series of oblong numbers, the ratio between the sides continually changes, and so it's seen to be variable and inconstant. So everything in the columns are all kind of associated with each other. So whenever we're looking at odd and even numbers, those are bringing in all their associated qualities. All right. So now for the bulk of the class here, what we're going to do is kind of go through in arithmology. So we'll look at the numbers 1 through 10, or their, we're going to call this the monad rather than the one. Maybe not such a huge distinction, but there is a sense sometimes in which these things kind of exist before number proper, that you have the monad, and then the one is sort of, or the number one is like kind of an expression of the monad, somewhat lower. That distinction isn't super important. All right, so for this trip through arithmology, I'm mainly relying on that text that I talked about, the theology of arithmetic, which is attributed to Plotinus. It's a complex text, and there's a lot of like very technical stuff about Greek mathematics that we're not going to get into. But hopefully, I'll be able to give you some taste of what's going on here. All right, so let's see. I'm just going to kind of go through like kind of lists of things. The work isn't super organized, and like I said, it's a kind of compilation of different materials, and it actually probably was never intended as a finished work, but as something more like a student's like lecture notes. All right, so the monad is said to be the source of all number. It's not really considered, even the number 1 isn't really considered a number in itself, but as the thing that is like the source of number. It's called stability. Part of that is because there's a lot of etymological reasoning where like monad sort of sounds like and is similar to the Greek word for stability. And there's a lot of that type of sort of etymological reasoning or reasoning by associations by sound throughout the whole work. The monad is said to preserve identity. This is because if you multiply a number by 1, you get the same. You know, 4 times 1 is 4, 6 times 1 is 6. But something multiplied by the monad is itself, and so the monad preserves identity. It is said to be neither even nor, no, we think 1 is an odd number, but they think of, they think of 1 as neither even nor odd, partially because if you add 1 to an even number, it becomes an odd number, and if you add 1 to an odd number, it becomes an even number. So it sort of participates in both evenness and oddness, and it's sometimes called even odd, like even hyphen odd. And as such, because even and odd are associated with male and female, it seemed to be androgynous. Or participating in both the male and the female, or somehow before or prior to the male and female. So it preserves all. It's said in the theology of arithmetic, it's said to be the most suited to reflect the principle of God and is like God. And so God coincides with the monad since he is seminally all things, meaning he's like the seed of all things and the source of all things. It just as the monad is for all number. All right, I'm going to read a quotation now from the theology of arithmetic. Just as without the monad there is in general no composition of anything, so also without it there is no knowledge of anything whatsoever, since it is a pure light, most authoritative over everything in general, and it is sun-like and ruling, so that in each of these respects it resembles God, and especially because it has the power of making things cohere and combine, even when they are composed of many ingredients and are very different from one another, just as he made this universe harmonious and unified out of things which are likewise opposed. So the monad is also sort of the principle of unity and gives unity and identity to all things. Now remember, for the Platonists and the Pythagoreans, the cosmos is a kind of single, unified, harmonious living being. This is why you have the idea of like the world soul, which world means like cosmos, not just the planet Earth. But this idea of there's one soul that unifies all things. And this is related to the monad and its power to unify things. Furthermore, the monad produces itself and is produced from itself, since it is self-sufficient and has no power set over it and is everlasting. And it is evidently the cause of permanence, just as God is thought to be in the case of actual physical things, and to be the preserver and maintainer of natures. So they say, they are the Pythagoreans, so they say that the monad is not only God, but also intellect and androgyne. It is called intellect because of that aspect of God which is the most authoritative, both in the creation of the universe and in general in all skill and reason. Even if this aspect of God were not to manifest itself as a whole in particular matters, yet in respect of its activity, it is intellect, since in respect of its knowledge, it is sameness and unvarying. Just so, the monad, which even if differentiated in the different kinds of thing, has conceptually encompassed everything within itself, as if it were a creative principle, and resembles God, and does not alter from its own principle, and forbids anything to alter, but is truly unchanging. Right? So the monad is called father, mother, and seed. It's the potential of every number, or the potential of every number lies within the monad, and it is therefore intelligible number in itself, but not manifesting anything actual. But everything are sort of conceptually within the monad. The Greek word monas, if you do isopsophia, like the Greek version of gematria, and enumerate that word, it sums to 361, which they take as the completion of the circle, right? The circle is 360 degrees, and so the 361 represents the return to the point that you started with. So it represents a complete and total circle. The image you're seeing there for the monad, you'll see all the different figures will be inscribed into a circle. So really, we're just looking at the point there for the monad. But the circle is also a symbol that's used for the monad as well. Let's see. It is called being. It's called the case of truth, simple, paradigm, order, concord, friend, life, happiness, and many other names as well. And it's also called Zeus, and associated with the god Zeus as the father and creator of all. All right, and now we have the dyad, the two. All right, let's see. One important thing that they make under the dyad is that adding 2 plus 2 is the same as multiplying 2 times 2. And so it seemed to have this property of equality. And therefore is also associated with justice and with like the measuring of 2 things and the balancing of things. It's associated with courage and called courage since it has advanced into action. It is called daring and impulse for the same reason. The idea that it's departed from the simple perfection of the monad and is taken a step towards the creation. It's also called opinion because opinion contains both truth and falsehood. It's called movement, generation, change, division, length, multiplication, addition, kinship, relativity, and ratio. For the relation of 2 numbers is of every conceivable form. So the dyad is also the source of the multiplicity and variation because the ratio, you can, the 2 numbers, whatever through, it's hard to say. You can have the ratios between any 2 numbers, right? And so all the different multiplicities of ratio, and ratio is seen to be the thing that really structures the physical world, just like ratio structures the musical scales. And so you have all the different ratios, which are ratios of 2 numbers. All right, let's see another quote here from the Theology of Arithmetic. So the dyad alone remains without form and without the limitation of being contained by 3 terms in proportionality, and is opposed and contrary to the monad beyond all other numerical terms, as matter is contrary to God or body to incorporeality. The dyad is associated with matter, where the 1 is associated with form and the immaterial. The dyad is often associated with matter and with the material. And it is, as it were, the source and foundation of the diversity of numbers, and hence resembles matter. And the dyad is all but contrasted to the nature of God in the sense that it is considered to be the cause of things changing and altering, while God is the cause of sameness and unchanging stability. So each thing in the universe as a whole is one as regards the natural and constitutive monad in it, but again, each is divisible insofar as it is necessarily partakes of the material dyad as well. Hence, the first conjunction of monad and dyad results in the first finite plurality. That'll be the number 3, which we'll talk about in a minute. The element of things, which would be a triangle of quantities and numbers, both corporeal and incorporeal. So the dyad is the midpoint between plurality and 3 and the monad 1. So it's a kind of intermediate step between the 2. It's like the source of plurality, but isn't yet plurality itself. Now, as I said, the Platonists associated the dyad with the limit and the unlimited. Now, it's formless because the polygons, which are considered to be the actuality, only begin with the 3, right? The 3 you can have a triangle, but with the dyad you only have a line, and so there's no polygon, and so it's not yet actual. Let's see, yeah, and for that reason it's described as indefinite, because the line can extend indefinitely, unlike like a triangle or a square, which is bounded indefinite. It's not considered to be a number. Sometimes it's called even, and sometimes it's not called even. Sometimes even and odd don't begin until 3, but often the dyad will be called even, though it's sometimes also said to be neither even nor odd. And for that reason, it is because it is not yet actual that it's not considered to be a full number. It's sometimes called nature, since it moves toward being, coming to be an extension from like a seed principle. So it's the movement from one thing to another, and is in likeness to the dyad. So nature, which moves from one thing to another, is like the dyad, like the monad was like God. It's called Rhea, the mother of the gods, for that reason, and also because the Greek word Rhea sounds similar to the Greek word meaning like flux or extension, and so it's associated with nature. It's also associated with the moon, because the moon is halved. I assume that's like the division into the waxing and waning phases. All right, let's move on to the triad. All right, so I've got there's some really, really good quotes here in the Theology of Arithmetic on the triad, so I'll mostly just read you a series of quotes here. All right, so on the triad has a special beauty and fairness beyond all numbers, primarily because it is the very first to make actual the potentialities of the monad: oddness, perfection, proportionality, unification, and limit. Those are all things that the monad and the triad have in common, but the triad is actual. Let's see. For 3 is the first number to be actually odd, since in conformity with its description, it is more than equal. The equal is the 2, so it's the 1 beyond 2. And it has something more than equal in another part, and it is special in respect of being successive to the 2 sources and a system of them both. So the 2 sources are the monad and the dyad, so the triad is successive to those, and also their sum. If you add the monad and the dyad together, 1 plus 2, you get 3. So it's the first number that comes after the sources. Let's see. The monad is like a seed in containing in itself the unformed and also unarticulated principle of every number. The dyad is a small advance towards number, but is not number outright because it is like a source. But the triad causes the potential of the monad to advance into actuality and extension. This belongs to monad, either to the dyad, and each and every to the triad. Hence, we use the triad also for the manifestation of plurality. And there's some stuff about just like the Greek sayings that use the 3. Let's see. There's a lot of cultural associations. It talks about how we, hence too, we traditionally invoke the dead 3 times. Moreover, everything in, like invoking the ancestors. Moreover, everything in nature, which has process and has 3 boundaries: beginning, peak, and end. That is its limit and its middle. And 2 intervals, that is increase and decrease. So you're increasing up to the middle point and then the middle limit point and then decreasing after. With the consequence that the nature of the dyad and either manifests in the triad by means of its limits. So one way you can think about this is that the dyad represents like extremes or polarities, and the triad as a mean, an average or a point in the center. The idea of different means and averages is really important for Pythagorean mathematics. We don't have time to go into it today, but there's 3 Pythagorean means. There's the arithmetic mean, which is what we mean is by like average in the normal sense of the word, the average between 2 numbers. And you also have something called the geometric mean and the harmonic mean, which is interesting to look into, but we don't have time to fully explain it right now. But the idea of the mean, of a middle point between 2 extremes, is really important for the understanding the nature of the triad. And that's something that I think really applies also to Hermetic Kabbalah and a lot of sort of patterns that we see in Hermetic Kabbalah and in the Golden Dawn tradition. All right, a couple more quotes here. The triad, the first odd number, is called perfect by some because it is the first number to signify the totality, beginning, middle, and end. When people exalt extraordinary events, they derive words from the triad and talk of thrice blessed, thrice fortunate. Again, this is just kind of an interpretation of Greek sayings and conventions, cultural conventions, right? Prayers and libations are performed 3 times. Triangles both reflect and are the first substantiation of being plane. Don't worry about that, we'll come back to that idea. Let's see, and there are 3 kinds of triangle: equilateral, isosceles, and scalene. Among the virtues, the Pythagoreans, likened it, the triad, to moderation, for it is commiserability between excess and deficiency. Moreover, I'm just going to skip that part too. Let's see, just one more quote here. The triad is the source in actuality of number, which is by definition a system of monads, right? Like the individual points that make up, like the triad could be thought of as individual monads in a sense. For the dyad is in a sense a monad on account of being like a source, but the triad is the first to be a system of monad and dyad, right? Because the triad involves both the one and the two and is their sum. But it is also the very first which admits of end, middle, and beginning, which are the cause of all completion and perfection being attained. The triad is the form of the completion of things and is truly number, and gives all things equality and a certain lack of excess and deficiency, having defined and formed matter with the potential for all qualities. At any rate, 3 is particular and special beyond all other numbers, in respect of being equal to the numbers which precede it, meaning that the 2 numbers that come before 3, 1 and 2, sum to 3. And that's not true of any other number after that. Okay, let's see. Well, another thing to know about the triad and maybe some of the way that the Greeks think about like monad, dyad, and triad is that in the Greek language, we have like, for adjectives and nouns, we have singular and plural. The Greeks also have a dual. So you have a singular, a dual, and a plural. And that linguistic factor of the Greek language is probably, part of the reason that they think about some of this stuff in the way that they do. Triad is also associated with the moon as waxing, waning, and full. It's associated with the 3 motions of the planets, their direct motion, their retrogression or retrograde motion, and then their stationary motion. When astrologers today still talk about, they'll say, in September, Mars is going to station, meaning that it'll come to briefly appear to come to a halt before going retrograde. So those 3 motions, direct, retrograde, and station, are associated with the triad. It's also associated with the 2 tropics, the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn, and the ecliptic, if you know some basic astronomy. Let's see, so it's with living creatures, it's associated with land, winged, and water creatures. And there's lots of other triads that it gets associated with as well. It's called friendship, peace, harmony. It's said to be cohesive and unificatory of opposites and dissimilars, and is also called marriage. Right, the tetrad here. So it's said that everything is completed in progression up to the tetrad. Now, as we're going through the numbers 1 through 10, the sum of the numbers from 1 to 4, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. So there is a sense in which by the time that we arrive at the triad, we're at completion, because the 4 and the 10 have this sort of equivalence, because 10 is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. It's associated with lots of groups of 4, like the quadrivium, which are the 4. The quadrivium, some of you might know it, as part of a Greek or classical, educational system. But the quadrivium is most specifically the 4 Pythagorean mathematical sciences of arithmetic, which looks at quantity in itself, geometry, which looks at like quantity in space, music, which looks at sometimes it's said to be as like quantity in time. But there's another way of talking about it too that I'm blanking on. And then finally, astronomy, which looks at quantity both in space and in time or in motion. So these are the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And those 4 things are also associated with monad, dyad, triad, and tetrad in that order that I gave. It's in society. It's associated with, and again, this is following this pattern of monad, dyad. Well, let me hold off on this for a second. All right, so this is one of the most fundamental kind of images or symbols used by the Pythagorean tradition. Is the tetractys here? So we've got 10 dots in total here, and they're arranged obviously in the form of a triangle, but we can think of them ordered in 4 layers. The first layer has 1 dot, the second 2, then 3, then 4. So this is the monad at the top, then the dyad, then the triad, then the tetrad. Yeah, Kristen, just like the yods in the earlier painting. The later Masonic tradition uses this symbol of the tetractys a lot, though they often replace the dots with little yods. But yeah, absolutely. And well spotted. Right. So we have these four things that sum to 10, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then on this pattern, there's lots of other sort of patterns of 4 that follow this model of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so I'll read you a series of them. So in society, we have man, then family, then village, then city. In the faculties, we have thought, then science, then opinion, then feeling. In the soul, we have, this is like coming out of the Platonic tradition, the rational soul, the willful soul, the emotional soul, and then the body. We have the 4 seasons of the year as well. I'm not sure which order they would have been attributed to the tetractys, but the 4 seasons of the year are attributed. Also, the body can be divided into the head, trunk, legs, and arms. Also, the 4, what we call the angles in astrology, you know, the ascendant, descendant, the midheaven, and the IC, the nadir. Those 4 points are also associated with the 4 and the tetrad. Also north, south, east, and west. The tetrad is said to comprehend the principle of soul as well as that of corporeality. For they, the Pythagoreans, say that a living creature is ensouled in the same way that the whole universe is arranged according to harmony. And so although they don't, as far as I know anyways, they don't yet actually use the language of like microcosm and macrocosm, this idea that the individual soul is also, the individual being is of the same structure as the whole of the cosmos is part of the Pythagorean tradition. And obviously that idea of as above, so below, microcosm and macrocosm, these are some of the really core parts of the Hermetic tradition. And so we can look at least one source for those things in the Pythagorean tradition. All right, so this is a version of the tetractys done by the important later esotericist, Robert Flood. And so we see that he is associating the different layers with different sort of qualities or principles. So the monad itself is associated with looks. This is light, the Latin word for light. So the monad is associated with light. And we actually saw that in the theology of arithmetic, the association of it with light. Excuse me. All right, and then the dyad, he associates it with light and darkness, right? So these are kind of the two extremes, the polarity. And obviously light would be associated with form, darkness with matter, and so on. And then the triad, between light and darkness, he has the principle of water, which Flood also calls the humid soul. This is from a kind of temperament theory about the origin of souls. And we can also think of water here as a kind of midpoint between light and darkness. And we can think of the role of water, like in Genesis or in other creation stories, as one of the first things that exists. But yeah, here it's being the water or the humid soul is the kind of midpoint between the light and the darkness, or their mean. And then finally, the tetrad is associated with the 4 elements of fire, air, water, and earth. Also, the tetrad and the tetractys are associated with these 4 geometric forms. So the monad is the point, the dyad is the line, the triad is the triangle or superficies, which means something like surface or plane. And then finally, the tetrad forms a solid form called a tetrahedron, right? A 4-sided figure defined by 4 points, which is a solid. So you have a progression from point to line to plane to solid. And so this is like going from the 2 sources of point and line to the first actual thing in their way of thinking, which is like the plane or the triangle. And the triangle is the simplest way to define a plane. And then finally to the solid, to and to matter, right? The actual existing world that we live in. All right, a little more here on the tetractys and the tetrad. So from a Pythagorean oath, and this is something that gets quoted by a lot of ancient authors. This is an oath that the Pythagoreans would have taken. I swear by the one, meaning Pythagoras, I swear by the one who has bestowed the tetractys to the coming generations, source of eternal nature into our souls. So you can see just how important, essentially important, the tetractys practice was for the Pythagorean tradition, and for the Neoplatonists as well. You'll see I had spelled detractors with a C there. You'll see here in this quote it's spelled with a K. You'll see it both ways. It's just different ways of transliterating the Greek. There's no difference. All right, and I've got a quotation there from Mathematics Useful for Understanding Plato by Theonos Smyrna. And he says, in the perfect world which results from these quaternities, meaning like the different series of four things, which I enumerated some of them, though there's lots more as well. And the perfect world, our world, which results from these quaternities is geometrically, harmonically, and arithmetically arranged, containing in power the entire nature of number, every magnitude in every body, whether simple or composite. It is perfect because everything is part of it, and it is itself a part of nothing else. This is why the Pythagoreans use the oath, whose formula we have reported, and through which all things are assimilated to number. And obviously that's the oath that you see there at the top that Theon is referring to. All right, so we'll probably go a few minutes over here, but from here on out, the first four numbers are definitely the most important, so we'll be able to move it a little bit faster through for 5 through 10. All right, so the pentad is said to encompass all number because it's the sum of even and odd. It's the sum of 2 and 3. It is called marriage because it is formed of male, the 3, and female, the 2. It's associated with the 5 Platonic solids, which are really interesting, though unfortunately we don't have time to go into them now. And the Platonic solids are also associated with the 5 elements. Now, they don't call the 5th element spirit. They usually call it aether, or sometimes they call it universe or like cosmos. But it's the same basic idea. It's described as a mediate, as being mediate or a midpoint of the decad, right? Because 10 divided by 2 is 5. And because of some other properties, like in the 3x3 magic square, the 5 has to be in the center of the magic square, and for other reasons as well. And for that reason, it's associated with the center and also with the heart. It's said to comprehend all natural phenomenon. It's associated with the 5 planets other than the sun and the moon, right? So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It's associated with the 5 senses and lots of other bodily patterns. The 5 is definitely associated, the pentad is definitely associated with the body and some like natural patterns. It's associated with health. Partially, the Greek word was hygeia, I think, is health in Greek. It's 5 letters and is often associated with the pentad, and sometimes actually like arranged around the points of the pentagram. It's also called justice and balance. It's called Aphrodite because it's male and female united, like under love, which is what Aphrodite does, is draws the people and different things together and harmonizes them. It's also called androgynous for that reason. All right, and then we have the hexad, the 6. The hexad is the first perfect number. A perfect number is a number which is equal to the sum of its divisors. So 6 is divisible by, every number, of course, is divisible by 1, but it's divisible by 1, by 2, and by 3, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. The second perfect number is 28. 28 is divisible by, let's see, what is it? 1, 2, 4, 7, and 14. And the sum of those numbers equals 28. So those are perfect numbers. And perfect numbers are actually still being investigated by contemporary mathematicians, and there's a lot of unsolved questions about them. Every known perfect number is even, though no one's actually been able to show that it's necessarily the case that there aren't any odd perfect numbers. So that's actually something that mathematicians are still engaged in, is the investigation of the perfect numbers. And a lot of these other fundamental patterns in arithmetic that the Pythagoreans were already interested in 2,500 years ago, which is pretty cool. Let's see, what else? So yeah, the first perfect number, it's called wholeness of limbs by the Orphics. For this reason, because the limbs are like its parts, its divisors, 1, 2, and 3, and since it's equal to the sum of its divisors, it's like equal to its parts, and so it's whole. It's the first even number, 2, multiplied by the first odd number, 3. The hexad is said to ensoul and harmonize the universe. It's associated with wholeness, with permanence, and it's especially associated with the soul. The soul gives articulation to the body, just as like the soul in general, or the general principle of the soul, gives articulation to all of matter. And again, this is like that kind of Platonian idea that the soul exists, both in its pure state, as like the soul of all things, or the world soul, and also the individual soul. It's associated with the 6 directions, up, down, north, south, east, and west. And as such, it's associated with the solid and the solid or like physical embodiment of the soul. It's called reconciliation, peace, and universe, or cosmos. It's said to be the perfection of the cosmos. It's also a very important number in the ratios that make up the basic mathematical ratios that make up the musical scales. So it's important for music as well. Though we don't have time to go into the musical stuff, unfortunately. But yeah, again, although we're not talking about it, music is incredibly important for the Pythagoreans and the Pythagorean tradition. Yeah, and that fact that I mentioned earlier of the fact that mathematical ratio is most definitely and unambiguously sort of manifest in music and in musical harmonies is kind of the core thing that gives them the insight that mathematics lies at the basis of reality. All right, here we have the heptad, the 7. It's also sometimes called the hebdomad. I'm not sure what the exact difference between the 2 words is, but it's known as both. So the heptad is really interesting. It's said to be not born of any mother and also to be a virgin. Now the idea that it's not born of any number is that it's not produced neither addition, multiplication, squaring, or cubing from 2 and 3 don't give rise to the 7. So the 7 is said to have no mother and father. It's also said to be virgin because none of the other numbers in the decad, the 8, 9, and the 10, they don't arise out of the heptad. So the heptad doesn't like unify with any of the other, doesn't sort of combine with any of the other numbers to produce more. So it neither has a mother nor a father, and is also said to be virgin because it doesn't unite with the others to produce more. It's associated with the 7 planets, also with the quartering of the lunar cycle into what we now have as the week. It's associated with the 7 Greek vowels. It's said to be indissoluble, again, because it doesn't arise out of the 2 and the 3. And so in that sense, it resembles the unity and is thought to kind of extend or arise directly from the monad and is similar to the monad in that way because it isn't produced by other numbers. All right, I'm going to read a quote here, again, from the Theology of Arithmetic on the heptad. Let's see. The reason for the 7th number being an object of reverence is as follows. The providence of the Creator God wrought all things by basing on the firstborn one, the source and root of the creation of the universe, which comes to be an impression and representation of the highest good. And he located the perfection and fulfillment of completion in the decad itself. And the Creator God necessarily considered that the hebdomad, which is again is just another name for the heptad, was an instrument and his most authoritative limb, and has gained the power of creativity. The heptad is associated with a lot of natural cycles, both like biological cycles, like the different ages of humanity, with the menstrual cycle, with the gestation of the fetus, and lots of other biological and sort of natural rhythms and patterns and cycles. It's called chance because, like chance, it controls all mortal affairs. It's also called Athena, both because it's virgin and because, as we saw, the monad is called Zeus, and Athena sprung directly from the forehead of Zeus. And so similarly, the heptad like springs from the sort of metaphorical like forehead of the monad. And so it's called Athena. All right, then we have the octad, which can also be called ogdoad. The octad is the first cube, right? It's 2 cubed, 2 times 2 times 2. And since it's derived from just the multiplication of the 2, which is called the even, and even is associated with the feminine, the octad or ogdoad is sometimes called mother and also called Rhea, just like the 2 was. Whereas the 2 is like the more like the principle of the mother. This is, or the principle of Rhea. This is like Rhea in extension, becoming actual. It's associated with harmony. It too, like 6, plays some really important roles in the setting up the ratios that define the musical scales. And so it's really important for that reason. It's associated with the 8 spheres, right? You have the 7 planetary spheres plus the sphere of the fixed stars. And because the 8th eighth sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars, surrounds everything else. The 8 is said to encompass all things. And I guess there's a Greek saying that all is 8. All right. Then we have the Ennead, the 9. All right, the Ennead is said to be the greatest of numbers because after the Ennead, right, in like the decimal scale, every number after this point will have to be written as a combination, of 2 different numerals. This is the greatest number that can be written as, a single numeral, and 9 is the biggest of the numerals. So it's said to be the greatest of the numbers, and it's an unsurpassable limit. It marks the end of specific identities, and everything is said to circle around within it. And after it, there is only repetition of what came before. It's significant that if you add the Ennead to the monad, you get the decad, which is in a way a kind of repetition of the monad. So the Ennead is used in this, the working out of this idea of the numbers as following a kind of cyclic pattern. It's called concord, limitation, and lack of strife. It's the first odd square. It's the square of 3. It's called Hera, right, because Hera is the wife of Zeus, and so it's paired with the monad. There's a sense in which the monad and the Ennead themselves form a kind of dyad. The monad is the beginning, and then the Ennead is like the limit. And so it's called Hera, the complement of Zeus. It's a triad of triads, right? It's 3 times 3. 3 groups of 3 is 9. And that pattern of like a triad of triads is very important for Orphic ritual. And so the Orphics really influenced the Pythagoreans. And so that remains important all through the Neoplatonic tradition. They say that Plato and Pythagoras, they derived a lot of their wisdom from the Orphic tradition. Let's see, the Earth is we saw the 7 planetary spheres plus the sphere of the fixed stars, and the Earth would be the 9th thing, which is the center, in a geocentric cosmology, is the center around which the other spheres turn. All right, and then last we have the decad, the 10. I'm going to read you a final quote here from the Theology of Arithmetic. Let's see, it's a bit of a long one, but I think it's worth it. Let's see. We have often said before that the creative mind wrought the construction and composition of the universe and everything in the universe by reference to the likeness and similarity of number, as if to a perfect paradigm. But since the whole was an indefinite multitude and the whole substance of number was inexhaustible, it was not reasonable or scientific to employ an incomprehensible paradigm. And there was a need of commensurability. Commensurability is like ratio, right? Something that's incommensurable is like the square root of 2, something that can't be expressed as a ratio. So that the creator God in his craftsmanship might prevail over and overcome the terms and measures which were set before him, and might neither contract in an inferior fashion nor expand in a discordant fashion to a lesser or greater result than what was appropriate. However, a natural equilibrium and commensurability and wholeness existed above all in the decad. It has encompassed seminally within itself all things, both solid and plain, even and odd, and even odd. Perfect in all manners of perfection, prime and in composite, don't worry about that, and equality and inequality, the 10 relations and diagonal numbers, spherical numbers and circular numbers, again, don't worry about that. In itself, it has no special or natural variation apart from the fact that it runs and circles back to itself. Hence, it was reasonable for God to use it as a measure for things and as a gnomon, which is like an architect's square, sort of, and as a gnomon and a straight edge when he added things to one another and fitted them together harmoniously. And this is why, both in general and in particular, things from heaven to earth are found to have been organized by it. Hence, the Pythagoreans in their theology called it sometimes universe, sometimes heaven, sometimes all, sometimes fate and eternity, power and trust and necessity, Atlas and unwearying. Atlas, like the Atlas who holds the world on his shoulders in Greek mythology. Atlas and unwearying, and simply God and Phanes and Son. Phanes is the first being, the creator in the Orphic cosmology. They, the Pythagoreans, called it universe because all things are arranged by it, both in general and in particular, and because it is the most perfect boundary of number, in the sense that decad is, as it were, receptacle. Just as heaven is the receptacle of things, they called it heaven. Skipping a little, they called it all because there is no natural number greater than it. But if one thinks about it, number recurs and circles back, in a sense, to the decad. The decad is also called Pan, and is associated with the Greek word Pan, because although the Greek god name Pan is from a different etymology than the word Pan, meaning all, there is that kind of etymological association made by this time, and so the decad gets associated with the god Pan because of its function as all. Yeah, I said it's called fate, eternity, power, custodian. It's representative of totality. And that's absolutely a meaning that continues in our tradition of the 10 as representing the totality of things. In the 10, the decad is thought to create the finished product of the universe. There's some other interesting stuff too about the mathematics of the number 55, but we are already over time, so I'm going to skip that. All right, so before we go sort of circle back to Crowley, we need to talk about two things that are not part of the Greek tradition. Actually, I mentioned some things like the square root of 2. The discovery that irrational numbers, numbers that can't be expressed as ratio, can actually be constructed. Like if you draw a right triangle whose short sides are both length 1, the hypotenuse will be length square root of 2. This is a big problem for the Pythagoreans. It actually kind of undermines some of their idea. When they think about number, they think about integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? The idea of things that can't be expressed, or as integers and as ratios of integers. The fact that there are numbers that can't be expressed as ratios is sort of problematic for them. And there's even a story, which probably isn't true, about a member of the Pythagorean school actually murdering another member who had revealed this fact about a right triangle being able to construct the square root of 2 to a non-initiate. They said that he was drowned. Though again, that story probably isn't true, but at least shows the seriousness that this was taken with. Now, in addition to that, and obviously all kinds of other things like negative numbers and imaginary numbers and all the other things that we have in modern mathematics that wouldn't have been acceptable to the Pythagoreans. We also have 0 and infinity. Now, there is no number 0 in the Greek tradition, and the Greeks are really uncomfortable with the idea of like nothingness or not. The idea that 0 could be a quantity is just sort of unthinkable to the Greek mind. And it's not until much later that the 0 makes its way into mathematics. It's first developed by Indian mathematicians, and then comes sort of up through Central Asia into the Islamic world, and then from like the Arabic world, eventually passes into Europe in I guess it's just a little before the Renaissance gets started. And there's a lot of mathematics. It might be easy to overlook how important it is, but there's a lot of mathematics that really doesn't work without the 0. And having the 0, the Arabs make huge advances in mathematics and in astronomy, and they succeed in basically fully mathematize what Newton does to physics. The Arabs basically do to astronomy, and Newton really builds on the Arabic work there. And the people like Kepler and Copernicus, who sort of come right before Newton, they're really building on the Arabic work, and having the 0 and the Arabic number system is really important. Now, also this idea of infinity, again, the Greeks really don't like infinity. It's sort of bad and problematic because it's chaotic and disordered, whereas we think of infinity as something sort of ultimate and transcendent, right, as a kind of like positive thing, whereas the Greeks see it as a very negative sort of state. But I think the modern idea is much closer to like the Qabalistic idea of the Ein Sof, right? That's not like the unlimited in the way that the Greeks think of the unlimited. It's a kind of positive infinity. And so, yeah, so these two ideas of 0 and infinity are really important parts of Hermetic Kabbalah, and also really important parts of modern mathematics. So we have to kind of modify the original Pythagorean system to include modern mathematics for Hermetic Kabbalah to make sense. All right, so now we're going to loop back around and continue that passage that we saw at the very beginning of Crowley's. Yeah, so continuing right on here. Crowley says, in the Qabalistic system, the original idea is 0, which appears under 3 forms, rather as, in Chinese philosophy, the Tao becomes manifested little by little through the day, or as, in the best of the Hindu systems, the god of destruction and annihilation, Shiva, becomes manifested through the infinite energy, Shakti. The system begins, therefore, with Ein, nothing, Ein Sof, without limit, and Ein Sof Or, the limitless light. Now these, we didn't really talk about this last week. These are like the 3 forms of the negative that we see in the Hermetic Kabbalistic system. And we'll talk about this more next class. Let's see, one may now proceed to imagine any point in this light. This is the Ein Sof Or, the limitless light. Still technically nothing, not yet something. But Crowley's saying one may now proceed to imagine any point within this light to select it for observation. The fact of doing so makes it positive. This gives the number 1, which is called Kether, the crown. The other numbers arise by reason of the necessity of thought, as explained in the following table. All right, so this is the last thing we'll do today. Hopefully we can do this in maybe 10 minutes. This is called the Naples arrangement. Crowley called it that because he was in the city of Naples when he first worked this out. So it's basically a kind of Crowley's version of an arithmology. All right, so before 1 through 10, we have the 3 veils of the negative. We see 61. 61 is the value of Ein, naught, which equals 0. And then 61 plus 146, this is Ein Sof. Sof has a value of 146, which also equals 0. This is like the next veil of the negative, which Crowley's calling it as the undefined or as space. Now, 61 plus 146 is 207. And now for the third, you have 61 plus 146 plus 207. 207 is the value of Or, meaning light, Aleph, Vav, Resh. And so the word Or is actually numerically equivalent to Ein Sof. And so Ein Sof Or then is 207 times 2, which is 414. There's some really interesting stuff that you can do there if you look up those numbers, like in 777 and play around with them. So now we have the Ein Sof Or as the basis of possible vibration. All right, now we get into the kind of arithmology proper here. So 1, the point, positive yet indefinable. Indefinable because it has no relationship to any other thing, kind of like the monad or like the 1 in the Neoplatonic system. It has no qualities or quantity or properties. All right, and then the 2 is the point distinguishable from one other. Now you have 2 points that can have a relationship. This is also the line, like we saw that progression of point, line, triangular plane, and then tetrahedron or solid. Crowley's following this same progression here. So now we have the point distinguishable from another, which also allows us to construct the line, and ratio and relationship. Then we have the 3, which is the point defined by relationship to 2 others, right? And again, now we can construct the plane or the triangle. Now, between the 3 and the 4, between what's called the supernal triad of Kether, Chokmah, and Bina, we have the abyss, which we'll talk about a lot more next week, or next class. I keep saying next week, but yeah, next class, which will be the first Sunday in September. So what month is it? Let's see. So the abyss lies between the ideal and the actual. Now, where for the Pythagoreans, the 3 and the triangle represented the actual. Crowley thinks of the actual being the solid. So just slightly different emphasis there. And so with 4, we have the point now defined by 3 coordinates. So matter, we have the 3 coordinates of the x, y, and z axes. That now defines like the point in space. And that this is, for Crowley, represents matter. Now, this is an interesting thing. Crowley is going to extend this logic into a 4th dimension, which is not part of the Greek way of thinking about things. So we now have motion or time, right? So now, where we had gone from the point to the line to the plane to the solid, we now have the solid in time. So something that can move and change. Crowley says the letter He, which has the value of 5. It is like the feminine letter in the tetragrammaton, so it's the womb, like the Yod He. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. For only through motion and time can events occur. All right, and so now we have 6. Right? So this is with Sephiroth. The point again, now self-conscious, because able to define itself in terms of the above. So Crowley's now departing a little bit from this sort of strictly mathematic Pythagorean kind of scheme, and now with the 6 is the idea of self-consciousness. Now for 7, 8, and 9, Crowley does something really interesting here. He takes these kind of the 3 qualities from like Indian thought of Sat, Chit, and Ananda, which are, it's usually given in the order of Sat, Chit, Ananda, but here Crowley's arranged it to correspond with Sephiroth. So the 7 is the point's idea of bliss, the 8 is the point's idea of thought, and the 9 is the point's idea of being. And the 10 is the point's idea of itself fulfilled in its complement, as determined by 7, 8, 9. So this is like the fulfillment or the full expression of the monad as the 10 and as actuality. And I think we can see a little bit of an echo of that sort of Plotinus's reasoning there about how, you know, the monad doesn't have a sort of a reason for generating the other things. There's no like plan or purpose. It's just the instantaneous manifestation of its fullness and of its sort of its self-consciousness, I guess, if you want to put it that way. All right, and then so the passage continues, and then this will be it for today. It will be seen from the above that by means of these 10 positive numbers, but not by any lesser number, one can arrive at a positive description of any given object or idea. So far, the argument has been erected on a rigid mathematical basis with only the slightest tincture of philosophy to give it form. But it is at this point that, for the purposes of describing the objects of thought and sense, one is compelled to join hands with the astrologers. The problem now is to assign to pure number the moral ideas which go with it. By moral, he means like the moral qualities, you know, like things like, you know, courage or wisdom. He's not talking about like, you know, good and evil or right and wrong or something like that. He's talking about the virtues. Let's see, this is partly a matter of experience, partly of tradition derived from older experience. It would be unwise to discard tradition with complete contempt, because all thinking is bound by the laws of the mind itself, and mind has been formed through thousands of years of evolution, and each man by the thoughts of his ancestors. The cells of all living brains are just as much the children of the great thinkers of the past as the development of the organs and limbs. There are very few people today who have heard of Plato and Aristotle. Not 1 in 1,000, perhaps 10,000 of those few have read either of them, even in translation. But there are also very few people whose thinking, such as it is not conditioned by the ideas of those 2 men. In the Tree of Life, therefore, is found the first attempt to connect the ideal with the actual. The Kabbalists say, for example, that the number 7 contains the idea of Venus, and the number 8 that of Mercury. And the connecting path between 1 and 6 refers to the moon, and that between 3 and 6 to the sign Gemini. Then what is the true meaning in the category of the real of these planets and signs? Here again, one is faced with the impossibility of exact definition, because the possibilities of research are infinite. Also, at any moment in any research, the one idea emerges into the other and clouds the exact definitions of the images. But this, of course, is the objective. These are all blind steps on the way to the great light, when the universe is perceived as one, yet with all its parts, each necessary and each distinct. So at the end there, we see a nice kind of return to some of the themes we've been talking about throughout the class. And now this idea of beginning to fill in the moral qualities and also these associations, you know, with the planets and the signs of the zodiac, this is all going to get filled in our next class. So this is sort of leading us into what we'll do in the following class. Now that we've looked at the basis of the some of the core of the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, and then also these sort of Platonic, Pythagorean, and Hermetic ideas here from antiquity that are related to that and form some of the conceptual structure for these things. And we can now look at the relationships and on to the next slide here. Some suggested practices for the next 2 weeks. It's not specifically listed here, but one of the things you can do is kind of look at what we did this week side by side with what we did last week. Look at sort of pure number and the qualities of pure number and how that interacts with the ideas of the Sephiroth and the various names. You know, we saw that, you know, the 6 and you know, the hexad in the Pythagorean system and the various qualities of that. How is that related to, you know, the idea of Sephiroth, right, to beauty and harmony? Yeah, so we can start looking at the relationships between pure number and the more kind of what Crowley calls like the literary aspects of the Sephiroth, you know, derived from an esoteric interpretation of Jewish scripture. So yeah, let's see. I'll go through these practices real quick and then say just a couple things about where we'll go from here. So for the next 2 weeks, the first one here is just a continuation of what I suggested last week, that if you continue the memorization of the names of the Sephiroth, both sort of transliterated, translated into English, and then also in Hebrew, as well as the numbers of the Sephiroth, that'll be really, I think, important for next time, and also just really important for your study. So if you don't have those 3 things already, now's a good time to do it. And I think we actually have 3 weeks before the next class, right? Because today's the 16th, right? So 2 weeks from now will be the 30th. So yeah, we won't actually meet again for 3 weeks. So in the next 3 weeks, it's a great thing to get under your belt if you don't have it already. And I'm also suggesting that you add to this the memorization of the divine names that we looked at the beginning. You can find those in 777 and in book 4 and in lots of other places as well. So it's great to memorize those and get those things down if you don't already have those as well. Now for some meditations, in a way kind of similar to what we did last time, just sort of simple meditations on these basic concepts. I'll suggest a meditation on the numbers 1 through 10. And I also suggest that you add in meditations. So no, Rose, we won't meet again on the 30th. We'll meet again the first Sunday in September, whatever that, I don't know what that date is, but whatever that is, the 5th or 6th or something, we'll meet that Sunday. Because we're meeting first and third Sundays of August, September, October. So yeah, not in 2 weeks. Yeah, it's the September 6th, thank you. Yeah, so meditate on the numbers 1 through 10, kind of like we did here today, in your own kind of, basically sort of beginning to build up your own arithmology. And then I also suggest that you add in the 0 and infinity, since these are really important ideas for modern Hermetic Kabbalah. You can also meditate on corresponding geometric figures. Like for the 1, you can also imagine this as like a point. For the 2, you can meditate on a line. For the 3, the idea of the plane or on a triangle, and so on. And so for the higher numbers, you could use, like some of the geometric shapes that we saw today, or you could come up with some of your own ways of thinking about these things. You could just imagine a group of like that many points. You can also work with the construction of the tetractys. Like for 3, you can imagine 3 points in a triangle. For 6, you can imagine like the tetractys with just the bottom row of 4 taken out. Right, so you have 1, 2, 3 for the number 6. And I'm also suggesting as an optional meditation to meditate on the tetractys itself. And we'll actually look at the tetractys again next class on September 6th. We'll look at the tetractys again in the way that the tetractys gets used in relationship to Hebrew Kabbalah, because there's some really interesting stuff that gets built on top of the pattern of the tetractys. So if you wanted to do some meditations on that, that would also be really interesting, I think. And also if you're a little more advanced, you could investigate the numbers 1 through 10 by looking at their gematria, like looking at different words that sum to those numbers, and also looking at various correspondences that you could link to it, like through the tarot, or through the values of the Hebrew letters that have those values. You could investigate the number 8 through Heth, which has the value of 8. And in Cancer and the chariot and the color scales and so on and so on. I want to say again one more thing about the tetractys here. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff that can be done with the tetractys, and we skipped over almost all of it, basically. But yeah, if you want to look into it, the theology of arithmetic that I read from there, that's a great place to start. There's also this book, the Pythagorean Source Book and Library, which is another really great resource here. And so there's a lot of really, really deep and profound mathematical patterns that are built on the tetractys. There's ways that you can arrange different sequences of numbers in the pattern of the tetractys and then derive all kinds of other really important mathematical principles and properties out of that. So there's a ton of stuff that you can do with the tetractys. We only looked at the most sort of basic and superficial level of that. Yeah, so that about wraps us up for today. We did go 15 minutes over. Hope that was, that works for everybody. But I think it was good to get through all of this sort of stuff. And I think we've now really got a good ground state for really jumping into Hermetic Kabbalah and to the Tree of Life. So yeah, in our next class, we'll look at the tree of life and patterns on the tree of life. We'll look at the planets on the tree. We'll look at the tree in relationship to cosmology. Look at some of the structure of the tree, the different columns and planes and triads within the tree. Yeah, elements, planets, and a lot of other stuff as well. And so hopefully the last two classes kind of give the basic ideas and patterns and concepts that we can now begin to use and put into practice. So you kind of like last time, we really just sort of went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and went through things in order. We're not going to do that anymore. We'll be looking at the tree and these patterns as a whole and in relationship to each other. So in your meditations, it's great to kind of help to really instill those sequences and running through the numbers 1 through 10 or the Sephiroth from Kether to Malkuth, and also backwards again, doing them in reverse order can also be really interesting. Yeah, so here's some information there. Contact information for me, places to get more info for more about TOTS. Also, we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of either the academic or initiatory track. And you can send that donation to PayPal to payments@tots.org. Let's see, Amy's asking, is there a way people who missed the first class can see it? It's available for members on the forum. Assuming you're the Amy, I think you are. Yeah, you should have access to that. So yeah, that's up on the forum, on the general discussion forum. There's a sticky thread. It's called something like archived webinars or something. If you look under there, you can find the link to the recording of the first class as well as the slides. And I'll put this class and, well, I don't know how important these slides are, but yeah, I can put them up again. I guess there's no harm in it. I'll put those up in the next few days as well for people to be able to review this recording. Let's see. Couple of the questions here. Latimer asked, what was the book again that you just showed? So I showed two. There was Theology of Arithmetic, sort of attributed to Iamblichus, but the author is unknown. And there's also a book here called the Pythagorean Sourcebook and Library, which is just a kind of compilation of, mainly a compilation of ancient Pythagorean texts. It was originally put together in the 1920s. And then in the 80s, it was edited and expanded by another author. So yeah, Pythagorean Sourcebook and Library. You can find both of them on Amazon relatively inexpensively. Those would be my two recommendations if you want to look more into the Pythagorean tradition. If anyone wants a recommendation for looking at Neoplatonic material, I recommend, this is a book by, I'll type in her name here. It's just called Neoplatonism, and I'll type in her name. It is with 2 I's. I believe she's based in Sweden. The book was written in English. It's not translated. That's a really nice introduction to Neoplatonic thought. Let's see. Someone, Refugee asked, was Crowley thinking of quantum mechanics in that first Book of Thoth slide? Let's see, I'm not sure if Crowley would have really been aware of quantum mechanics then. I mean, quantum mechanics would have started to have been formulated by that time that he was writing that, but I'm not sure what Crowley's level of awareness would have been. So my answer is I don't know, maybe. But whether Crowley intended it or not, making that connection could certainly be interesting, whether or not Crowley did himself. Yeah, something like once you observe the light, it becomes a point. Yeah, I see what you mean about the connection to quantum mechanics there. Yeah, again, I sort of doubt that Crowley is intentionally making that reference, though I don't know for sure. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in, and we're now at 20 minutes over when we were supposed to stop, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.